So my guest for this session is Jared Cohen. He's an adjunct fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations, and his new job is the head of Google Ideas. He was formerly in the State Department as an advisor to the Secretary of State, and he was instrumental in bringing 21st century statecraft, particularly in the use of understanding and making use of technology. And I got to know Jared in Baghdad when I accompanied him on the first ever tech delegation to that country. And it's great to talk to him without a helmet and a flak jacket. Please welcome Jared Cohen. So Jared, I know that you've been following the use of these new technologies internationally for quite a while, but tell me how you first noticed what was happening internationally, particularly with youth, in adopting these new technologies and what it meant.
Yep. I could actually tell you the exact date, December 28th, 2004. I had been in Iran for about a week. I'd gone to interview opposition leaders, reformists, and had my room raided about 3.5 days into the trip, and my whole research had kind of collapsed. And I basically just started wandering around this country that has 70 million people, where 67% are under the age of 30, just looking for some friends, right? Because what do you do? My research was out the door, and my visa allowed me to be in the country for a while. So in wandering around the country, I was in the southern city of Shiraz, and I was in one of these very busy marketplaces. And I saw something really strange, which is in one of the really busy intersections, there were about 40 different young people tapping away on their cell phones. And I asked one of them what he was doing, and he was recruiting a bassist for his band. I asked a bunch of others what they were doing. They were trying to get a date, figure out where the party was, largely kind of recreational and social activities. And I asked them to show me how they were doing this, and they said, "Well, we're using Bluetooth." I said, "Well, where's your earpiece?" They said, "What earpiece?" They explained then and showed me how you can call and text complete strangers using Bluetooth, even if you don't know what their name is and where they're standing. And I said, "You're all crazy. Aren't you worried you're going to get caught doing this?" And they said, "Nobody over 30 knows what Bluetooth is." So it summed up this fascinating generation gap, but more importantly, it summed up an innovation gap, because when I came back to the United States, there were two pushbacks on the significance of young Iranians flirting by Bluetooth. The first was that, from a technical standpoint, people could understand why young Iranians were able to do this, but they thought it was creepy. Why would you call and text complete strangers? Well, Bluetooth was built to solve for the problems of a free and open society, not to solve for the social and recreational problems of a repressive society. And then second, the tools that young people were using to organize to do social and recreational things were the same tools that they then used several years later in June of 2009 to orchestrate the Green Revolution.
Well, let's talk about that. So you feel there's a direct connection between that and using it for their social activities, in a political sense. By that time, the governments still were unaware of the power of these networks. Weren't they trying to block them even before then?
So it's a cat and mouse game between a repressive regime and the population. And at the end of the day, technology has an empowerment bias, and it empowers people for good and for ill, both regimes and citizens or consumers. And there's no shortage of instances in which regimes infiltrate, block, censor, filter, but there's also tons of counterexamples of the population getting around that. And so I argued that in the context of Iran, young Iranians have been training in civil society activism for years without actually realizing it. Then they kind of showcase what they've got in the Green Revolution. They get one shot to kind of catch the government by surprise. The government cracks down, sort of fixes the, quote, mistakes that it made that allowed for this to happen. Then the population innovates again. And now we're going to see this playing out in the Middle East and North Africa. Right? All these populations of young people have caught their governments by surprise. The governments are now coming back. They're sharing information with each other. The populations are sharing information with each other. It's kind of a big contagion of kind of digital activity, both on the regime side and on the population side.
And how do you assess the importance? There's been some controversy about how much these technologies really did contribute to Arab Spring in Egypt and the subsequent protests in the Middle East afterwards. I understand you might have got a chance to look at it firsthand in Egypt.
So the degree to which technology had an impact changes depending on the context, but there's no doubt that technology had an impact, most importantly as an accelerant. Technology accelerates everything, again, for better or for worse. And I'll tell you two quick stories that I think illustrate this, one from Tunisia and one from Egypt. And I was in Egypt during the revolution. I spoke to a Tunisian activist actually before the revolution in Egypt took place, about 2.5 weeks before I went. And I asked him this exact question: how much did technology play a role in the Jasmine Revolution? And he said it played really not a huge role in organizing it, but shh, don't tell anyone. Otherwise, nobody will pay any attention to this tiny country in North Africa. He said media cares about us because they think that there's this sort of technological revolution that's happening. And he said there are certain realities that, when Mohammed Bouazizi set himself on fire, technology allowed those images of him up in flames to spread like wildfire throughout the country and really serve as a symbol. It allowed citizens to fill a gap that was left by mainstream media, or where mainstream media was late to arrive. I think at the time, MSNBC was doing a story on Martha Stewart's dog biting somebody, and CNN was interviewing a robot contestant on Jeopardy! That's sort of what was going on in the world. And what ultimately happened was the population, through technology, was able to get information out there, tease the mainstream media in a way that the mainstream media came in and then amplified it. In the case of Egypt, it was very interesting because what technology did was it complemented what were actually, at its core, traditional organizing tactics. I always find it ironic that in Egypt, the two tools that were primarily used for organizing in Egypt were a tool that arrived in Egypt around 600-700 AD, the mosque, and a tool that arrived in Egypt, I guess around 2006, 2007, Facebook. Two tools that arrived at very different times in history, one organizing the young people, one organizing the older generations, but both actually converging. And I remember I was in the streets of Egypt, and I asked a young person, I said, what got you into the streets? He said, I would have just watched this on Al Jazeera, and then Mubarak shut my internet down and made this my issue. I talked to another person who said, what was I going to do? Sit at home in my tiny house that I share a room with two brothers in and sit around and play on a computer that didn't work? Tap away on my phone, which also didn't work? I wanted to see what was going on.
So are you saying that shutting down the internet had the unintended consequence of saying, we can't stay at home anymore because all our fun stuff at home is gone, so we'll go out in the streets and protest?
I'm saying there's some anecdotes that I heard that suggest a trend like that. But I think if I'm being more analytical about it, Mubarak tried to shut down the internet. Ben Ali tried to shut down the internet. It didn't work in either of their cases. And one could make an argument, and I think there's reason to believe that a lot of young people view the freedom to connect as a fundamental human right. And when the government shuts everything down and you're completely unable to communicate with your peers and get access to information and each other, you run the risk as a government of turning something into an issue for people that otherwise would have watched on the sidelines.
So what do you make of the Malcolm Gladwell argument? That maybe it dovetails actually with your anecdote. Essentially, he seems to be arguing that this thing has blown all out of proportion by our press lionizing the use of social media, and that they really didn't have that big a role in this, and it's all an exaggeration.
I just think it's the wrong question to ask. There's so much debate right now being driven largely by people like Gladwell that sort of engulfs us in this conversation about, is the internet good, is it bad, is it important, is it not important? And there's sort of two facts that nobody can actually refute. One, the technology is spreading at a pace that is exponentially increasing every single day. Two, the technological tools have an empowerment bias, both for good and for ill. So it empowers people for good and for ill. So to me, the real question to ask is not, does technology matter? Not, is technology empowering people for good or for ill? But if it's empowering people for good or for ill, and those that aren't connected today will be our most connected users tomorrow, how do we ensure that that empowerment is a net positive? And the time to actually influence that is now, when access to the internet is 2 billion, access to mobile devices is 5 billion, with most of those not being smartphones or feature phones. How do we rally the NGO communities, the governments, the private sector entities, everybody that sort of has any reach anywhere in the world to ensure that all these tools that are arriving are positively impacting societies, recognizing you can never fully remove the negative use cases?
Well, so you worked at the State Department. I'm sure there's been a lot of discussions about that. When you talk about how do we influence, the question is, what is our role to influence? With this communication, people are probably smarter than ever about detecting when some large power overseas wants to influence them. People, like you say, are empowered there. How do you get over the idea that our influence may not be welcome?
Well, so I think the way that I think about technology, and I call them connection technologies because they connect people to information, each other, and then actual resources, financial, health, education, judicial, and so forth. And I remember when I came into the State Department in 2006, it was brought in by Secretary Rice, and she had been a mentor of mine, and we talked a lot about the intersection of technology and youth demographics around the world and how they were using these. And one of the pushes we made towards the end of the Bush administration, last 2.5 years, was to move away from this construct of technology as a tool to just communicate and advocate policy. Because at the end of the day, you're right. People care about the messenger, not the message. You can have the best message in the world, but if it doesn't come with the right alternatives, it doesn't matter. And over the 4 years that I was in government, and now since I've left government, one of the things that I've seen is there's a real focus on how do we use these tools of empowerment to financially include people, to give people access to judicial systems they wouldn't have access to otherwise, to ensure that people who are removed from the educational systems have access to critical thinking. And we're only just beginning to enter into this space, but I think the most interesting intersection of technology and international relations is how ordinary citizens who now have mobile devices, over time, as those devices become better, will be able to get access to certain opportunities that they didn't have access to before.
And can we amplify that process?
I think there's a role for government. I don't think government can do it on its own. I think what you need is multiple sectors, multiple disciplines, multiple experiences. So, if you look at the public sector, what the public sector has is deep knowledge of a lot of different issues around the world, relationships and access to a lot of different stakeholders around the world. It does not have the technology expertise. And every single technology company out there is increasingly developing attributes that are broader than just a corporation, whether they want to or not. They're developing the attributes of a think tank with de facto expertise on technology. They're developing a role just by virtue of the products that they're building and putting out there, not knowing all the different use cases that people will ultimately embrace. And so I think different companies will embrace this role in different ways, but there's no doubt that the private sector has a role that's more significant in international relations than just commercial.
Your former boss, Secretary Clinton, argued favorably about internet freedom, and she took this message out to the world. And in a sense, I thought it was ironic because your current employer, Google, had a very difficult time in China. And in my observation, companies like Google were pretty much left on their own to try to figure out how to make their way through the huge problems that were presented to them, particularly from the very beginning, the one that they had to censor the search engine there. And I remember a congressional hearing where that Google and other companies really were taking over the coals for their cooperation, yet there was no government backup saying, passing a law saying, well, it's illegal for a company to deny them. They were pretty much left on their own there. Do you see a way around that? Do you think that we're going to give those companies more tools to promote freedom in their products, even when those countries will face the Googles and Facebooks of the world and saying, sorry, it's our local laws. You must censor. You must help us oppress our citizens.
It's a tough question. I was in government at the time of the situation that you're referring to, and a number of others. And there's just not a lot of precedents for these kinds of things. I mean, I found myself in a little bit of a kerfuffle during the Green Revolution over outreach to Twitter.
You want to tell us what that was?
Well, I mean, in the midst of the Green Revolution, I followed Mousavi on Twitter, the opposition leader, and he had mentioned that Twitter was going to shut down its platform to do scheduled maintenance. And I, along with I'm sure what was a lot of other people out there, reached out to Jack Dorsey, who at the time was chairman of Twitter, and sort of explained the context of what was happening in Iran and the role that Twitter was playing. And Twitter, on its own devices, decided to delay their maintenance, whether it was, my contact or dozens of others' contacts, who knows? But the point is, they did it. there were really mixed reactions to this. Did this, the other backstory is the president that morning had said there won't be any meddling in Iran. And so this sort of raised this question of, did this constitute meddling? And we started to ask real questions of, is it meddling if a private sector company is in the United States and their free platforms are available elsewhere? And the reason I tell this story is I think that in the future international system, you're going to have individuals who we should think of as consumers, you're going to have states, you're going to have private sector companies. You just have more actors than you had before. And they're going to bump up against each other and complement each other and push against each other in ways that we just haven't seen before. And what it means is there's new choices that companies and governments and consumers are going to have to make, and oftentimes there's not precedents for these.
Okay, so we're going to take time just for a couple questions. Before we do, and well, maybe the mics find the people with questions. I understand that you're leaving straight from here to a conference you're running in Dublin. Can you tell us about that, what you're doing for Google?
Yeah, in my new capacity at Google, one of the things that Google Ideas does is looks at those kind of complex, global intractable challenges where there's not an obvious link to, philanthropy, there's not an obvious link to core business, but there's, clearly some relevance to technology. So challenges like radicalization. And so we're actually bringing together about, I think, 84, 85 former gang members, former religious extremists, former nationalist extremists, and former right-wing extremists, as well as survivors of terrorism and violence.
Who's doing the seating chart?
It's complicated. And we're doing this in partnership with the Council on Foreign Relations and the Tribeca Film Festival. And the goal is to build a network of credible voices, people that used to be part of violence and have now renounced it and are working against it, to serve as a counter movement to all those negative brands out there, from Al-Qaeda to sort of name your gang or name your extremist group.
That's fascinating. Okay, so we have any questions for Jared here? Okay.
Jason Freilich, HarperCollins Publishers. So we've all talked about the events in Egypt and in the Middle East in general. Do you think that this kind of change can happen with using technology with much more established and developed countries such as China or India?
China's a tricky one. There's obviously demographic challenges and urban-rural challenges that China's going to face in the future. But with revolutions at large, here's the observation about it that I make going forward, which is in the future, it will be easier and faster to start a revolution, but it's still going to be just as hard to finish one. It's still going to be just as hard to stage a real, meaningful, and successful revolution. Ultimately, what technology does, as I said before, is it accelerates things, but it also allows citizens to generate more noise. Where this gets interesting is that noise, that virtual noise, that virtual activity that blends people in the country and people out of the country, can result in a government actually overreacting and assuming a revolution is there that actually isn't really that viable. On the other hand, what the noise can do is it can hide what are actually quite strong ties from being inside of the government, and it can lead the government to underreact to what in fact is a real revolution. And so this introduction of noise, I think, becomes very interesting. I don't know how it'll all play out in the Middle East and North Africa right now. What I do know is, at the end of the day, if a revolution doesn't actually produce new leaders with different last names who can run for president and deliver for the people in a way that the previous regime didn't, you're going to see a very similar situation to what you saw with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, where ultimately people go back to the old systems.
Okay, other question? There's some up front there. I don't know.
Hello. Hi, my name is Malvina. I'm from Columbia University. The question I have is about Google Ideas, and I'm really interested in the space you just mentioned you want to occupy, which it's one where not the public sector and private sector don't really have solutions for core issues. Could you talk about some of those issues and maybe short and long-term plans for Google Ideas?
Absolutely. I should say I'm speaking not in my Google hat, but in the hat that you see up there. But with that caveat, Google Ideas is it's built on this assumption that technology is part of every problem and part of every solution in the world. And as more people come online and get access, that's only going to be more the case. So it means that name your challenge, whether there's an obvious link to technology or not, there's some relevance to technology. And where we see the most people thinking about how technology impacts challenges and what to do about them is largely in the philanthropic space and largely in spaces that clearly intersect with core business. But there is this middle category. The places that kind of make you scratch your head and sort of ask yourself the question, why is this technology company working on this particular challenge? Well, the answer is if you can convene around it, if you can help people understand how technology is changing these challenges, if you can build things and use technology to further solutions, then whether the link is obvious or not, why not go for it? A challenge like radicalization, for instance, there's no doubt that radicalization is one of the most important unanswered challenges we face. If there's any dent that anybody can make, join the party of solution finders. But I think at the end of the day, what a technology company has is technology expertise and an ability to build certain things. It's not necessarily the best position to sort of solve these specific problems, but it is in a good position to build coalitions of different stakeholders from different sectors, different disciplines, and different experiences to try to reframe these things in ways that account for technology and actually build these multi-stakeholder solutions.
Well, Jared, it's been too short, but I know it will be fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.